I spent years in the intelligence business learning a simple discipline that Washington routinely forgets. When an adversary states a position clearly, repeatedly, and in public, you treat it as policy unless proven otherwise. Russia's declaration that Western troops operating on Ukrainian soil would be considered legitimate military targets was not a fit of anger, not rhetorical bluster, and not aimed at domestic consumption. It was a formal signal delivered through official channels, consistent with prior Russian doctrine and reinforced by years of stated red lines regarding NATO's physical presence in Ukraine. Intelligence officers are trained to distinguish noise from signal. This was signal. The problem is that Western policymakers no longer want intelligence, they want reassurance. The warning was issued because London, Paris, and other capitals openly discussed deploying forces under the euphemisms of security assistance, monitoring, and regeneration of Ukrainian forces. In military terms, those labels are irrelevant. Any organized foreign force operating in a battle space is part of the war, regardless of how politicians dress it up. Russian planners understand this perfectly, and they said so. The intelligence failure did not occur in Moscow. It occurred in Washington and European capitals that pretended not to hear. I watched this pattern develop over decades. Clear adversary statements are reinterpreted through comforting assumptions about deterrence, escalation, control, and supposed shared interests in restraint. Analysts who point out the obvious that Russia will act on what it says are sidelined as alarmist, while policy moves forward on the belief that escalation can be managed by intent rather than capability. This is how intelligence becomes fiction. The strategic consequence is immediate and dangerous. By treating explicit warnings as negotiable narratives, Western governments increase the risk of direct confrontation while telling their publics that nothing fundamental has changed. From an intelligence standpoint, that is malpractice. Russia's military doctrine does not recognize limited Western presence on Ukrainian soil as benign. It recognizes it as intervention. Once that threshold is crossed, targeting logic follows automatically. The hard lesson here is not ideological, it is operational. When an adversary removes ambiguity, you do not respond by inventing your own, you reassess posture, policy, and risk. America and its allies have done the opposite. They have layered political fantasy over strategic reality, convincing themselves that words can neutralize weapons and that intentions override declared red lines. That belief has no foundation in intelligence, tradecraft, history, or military logic. It is the opening chapter of a self-inflicted crisis, written the moment policymakers chose to reinterpret a warning instead of respecting it. What followed Russia's declaration was not a serious reassessment of risk, but a familiar bureaucratic ritual I have seen too many times. Intelligence was not allowed to drive policy. It was reshaped to justify decisions already made. Instead of asking whether deploying Western forces into Ukraine would trigger predictable military responses, policymakers asked intelligence agencies how escalation could be managed. That shift in questioning is critical. When leaders ask how to make a risky policy work rather than whether it is fundamentally unsound, intelligence stops being an analytic discipline and becomes a support function for political intent. In the Ukraine case, assumptions hardened quickly. Russian warnings were downgraded as deterrence messaging. Targeting declarations were reclassified as bargaining posture. Analysts were encouraged, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, to emphasize ambiguity where none existed. I have watched this mechanism operate before Iraq, Libya, and Syria. The process is always the same. Dissenting assessments are buried in footnotes. Worst-case scenarios are labeled improbable. Confidence replaces evidence. What makes this episode more dangerous is that the intelligence being ignored is not obscure or classified. Russia's position was stated openly, repeatedly, and consistently. There was no need for covert collection to understand intent. The distortion occurred because acknowledging reality would have forced policymakers to confront the consequences of their own rhetoric. Western governments had publicly committed to standing with Ukraine, so intelligence was pressed into service to maintain the appearance that this commitment carried no escalatory cost. From a tradecraft perspective, this is inversion. Intelligence is supposed to constrain policy by mapping capabilities, intentions, and red lines. Instead, it was used to soften them. Analysts were pushed to argue that Russia would not act on its stated doctrine because doing so would be irrational. That word is the graveyard of serious analysis. Declaring an adversary irrational is how policymakers excuse themselves from understanding him. Russia's calculus is not emotional, it is strategic. Allowing Western troops to operate in Ukraine without response would collapse Moscow's own deterrence credibility. Any competent intelligence officer understands that. The strategic consequence of bending analysis in this way is cumulative blindness. Decision makers begin to believe their own filtered assessments, mistaking political comfort for strategic stability. This is how escalation risk migrates from hypothetical to operational. Forces are deployed under false assumptions. Red lines are crossed under the illusion that they are flexible. When reality reasserts itself, it does so violently and without warning. The hard lesson intelligence professionals learn early, and policymakers keep forgetting, is that facts do not negotiate. Intentions do not override doctrine, and adversaries do not abandon declared positions to preserve Western narratives. When intelligence is forced to conform to policy, it fails at its only real purpose, preventing leaders from lying to themselves. One of the most dangerous illusions now driving Western policy is the belief that military forces can be inserted into an active war zone without becoming part of the war. I call this the NATO fiction, the idea that labels can neutralize reality. Trainers are not combatants. Monitors are not targets. Security hubs are not bases. This is political language, not military logic. From an intelligence perspective, it is nonsense. Any organized foreign force operating on Ukrainian territory, regardless of mission description, alters the battle space. It provides targeting opportunities, command and control nodes, logistics chains, and political leverage. Russia understands this because Russia plans wars the way wars are actually fought. Western governments, by contrast, have convinced themselves that legal phrasing and alliance coordination somehow change how adversaries calculate threat. They do not. Russian doctrine does not care whether a British or French unit is guarding a depot, monitoring a ceasefire, or training Ukrainian personnel. If that unit enables Ukraine's warfighting capacity, it becomes a legitimate target. Moscow said this openly, yet NATO planners continue to pretend that there is a meaningful distinction between presence and participation. This fiction survives because it is politically convenient. It allows leaders to signal resolve without admitting escalation. It allows publics to be reassured that we are not at war while military footprints expand incrementally. Intelligence officers are supposed to puncture these illusions, but when the illusion becomes policy, speaking plainly becomes career suicide. I have seen this dynamic before. In Iraq, advisors were not combatants until they were. In Syria, special operators were not engaged in hostilities until they were taking casualties. The pattern is always incremental, and the justification is always semantic. The strategic consequence is predictable. Adversaries do not play along, they respond to capabilities, not press releases. By clinging to the fiction of non-belligerent force deployment, NATO increases the likelihood of a direct clash while denying itself the ability to plan honestly for that outcome. When Russian missiles strike what Western governments have labeled support facilities, leaders will act surprised, even though the logic was laid out in advance. The hard lesson here is painfully simple. War does not recognize categories invented for domestic consumption. International law does not override targeting doctrine, and adversaries do not suspend military logic to accommodate Western political theater. Intelligence realism demands that force equals risk, presence equals participation, and intervention equals consequence. Ignoring that reality does not prevent escalation. It guarantees that escalation will arrive unacknowledged, unmanaged, and misunderstood. At this stage, intelligence failure is no longer accidental. It becomes systemic. What replaces serious analysis is narrative warfare, not against the adversary, but against domestic audiences and allied governments. I have watched intelligence briefings turn into messaging sessions where the goal is not to assess risk, but to sustain confidence. In the Ukraine case, this took a familiar form. Media narratives emphasized unity, resolve, and moral clarity while quietly suppressing discussion of escalation mechanics and military thresholds. Intelligence agencies were not asked to challenge these narratives, they were asked to support them. The distinction matters. When intelligence becomes an instrument of narrative management, tradecraft erodes. Analysts learn which conclusions are acceptable before the evidence is fully examined. Over time, self-censorship replaces rigor. In practical terms, this meant that Russian statements were reframed as psychological pressure rather than operational intent. The possibility of deliberate Russian targeting of Western forces was discussed as a remote contingency, even though Moscow had already defined those forces as legitimate targets. Instead of red teaming Russian decision making, Western planners red teamed public reaction. The question was not whether escalation would occur, but how to communicate when it did. That inversion is fatal. It reflects an institutional shift away from preventing conflict toward managing perception after the fact. The strategic consequence is a feedback loop of false confidence. Leaders cite media coverage as evidence of stability. Media rely on official briefings that downplay risk. Intelligence, trapped between them, loses its corrective function. This is how a state drifts into war while insisting it is acting to preserve peace. I saw this dynamic crystallized during previous conflicts, but the scale now is larger and the stakes higher. Russia is not a weak actor testing boundaries. It is a nuclear armed state articulating clear conditions for escalation. Ignoring that reality in favor of narrative coherence is not optimism, it is denial. The hard lesson intelligence professionals internalize, often too late, is that narrative comfort is the enemy of strategic clarity. Wars do not begin because leaders lack information. They begin because leaders choose stories over facts. When intelligence tradecraft is subordinated to narrative warfare, escalation is no longer a risk to be mitigated, it becomes an outcome waiting for a trigger. One of the starkest contrasts in this crisis is the difference between Russian clarity and American ambiguity. From an intelligence standpoint, Moscow has been unusually direct. It stated its red lines, it identified specific actions it would treat as hostile. It named Western forces on Ukrainian soil as legitimate targets. That level of declaratory precision is rare in modern conflict, and it is usually intended to reduce miscalculation, not provoke it. By contrast, US and allied messaging has been deliberately vague. Officials speak in conditional language, layered assurances, and strategic ambiguity, as if uncertainty itself were a form of deterrence. It is not. Ambiguity works only when both sides fear the unknown. Here, Russia has removed uncertainty about its response, while the West pretends that clarity does not exist. That asymmetry is dangerous. In intelligence analysis, ambiguity on one side and clarity on the other does not stabilize a situation. It shifts initiative to the actor willing to act on stated doctrine. American policymakers seem to believe that by not formally declaring war, they can avoid being treated as belligerents. Russia does not share that belief, and it has no reason to. Western forces enabling Ukrainian military operations changed the balance of power on the ground, regardless of mission description. Russian planners assess threats based on effects, not intent statements. The strategic consequence of America's ambiguity is erosion of credibility. Allies are confused about thresholds, adversaries are skeptical of Western resolve. Most importantly, Washington loses the ability to signal effectively because its words no longer align with its actions. In intelligence terms, signaling fails when declaratory policy diverges from operational behavior. Russia's signals, by contrast, are aligned. It has matched rhetoric with military posture consistently throughout the conflict. The hard lesson here is not that Russia is more honest or more moral. It is that clarity reduces surprise. Ambiguity increases it. When one side states exactly what it will do and the other side responds with narrative fog, the fog does not blind the adversary. It blinds the policymakers who created it. That is how miscalculation becomes likely even when warnings are explicit. By the time a government begins believing its own narratives, the damage is already unfolding beneath the surface. In the Ukraine conflict, the strategic consequences of narrative-driven policy are no longer theoretical. They are structural. The first consequence is the steady erosion of deterrence. Deterrence depends on credibility, and credibility depends on alignment between words, capabilities, and demonstrated willingness to act. Western governments have fractured that alignment. They speak of restraint while expanding involvement, of de-escalation while normalizing deeper military integration, and of red lines while denying that any have been crossed. From an intelligence standpoint, this signals incoherence, not strength. Adversaries interpret incoherence as opportunity. The second consequence is allied confusion. European states are being drawn into commitments whose military implications are deliberately obscured. Force deployments are discussed as technical details rather than acts of war, intelligence assessments that should clarify risk instead smooth it over. This creates a coalition that is politically unified but strategically misaligned, a dangerous condition in any confrontation with a capable adversary. The third consequence is loss of escalation control. When leaders deny the reality of escalation, they forfeit the ability to manage it. Decisions are made incrementally, each framed as reversible, until the cumulative effect becomes irreversible. At that point, options collapse. Intelligence warnings arrive late because acknowledging them earlier would have contradicted official narratives. I have seen this sequence before, and it never ends the way policymakers expect. The final consequence is reputational. America's credibility suffers not because it lacks power, but because it misrepresents how it uses that power. Allies learn that U.S. assurances are elastic. Adversaries learn that U.S. red lines are rhetorical. Over time, this undermines the very order Washington claims to defend. The hard lesson intelligence officers are trained to deliver, and leaders resist hearing, is that strategic reality does not care about narrative consistency. Facts accumulate whether acknowledged or not. Believing one's own stories does not insulate a state from consequence. It accelerates the moment when consequence arrives without preparation. After decades inside and around the intelligence system, I have learned that its greatest failure is not secrecy, bias, or even incompetence. It is submission. Intelligence fails most often when it yields to the political need for reassurance. That is what this crisis ultimately reveals. The collapse of the American strategic narrative did not begin with Russian missiles or Ukrainian battlefields. It began when intelligence was treated as an obstacle to policy rather than its foundation. Every warning Russia issued about Western troops in Ukraine was clear, consistent, and rooted in doctrine. Those warnings were not misunderstood. They were inconvenient. So they were reclassified as messaging, downgraded as bluster, and neutralized by narrative. This is how intelligence becomes fiction. Not because analysts fabricate facts, but because institutions teach them which facts are safe to emphasize. The hard lesson here is institutional, not personal. Systems that reward consensus over accuracy will always drift towards self-deception. Systems that punish dissent will always be surprised by outcomes they were warned about in advance. In intelligence tradecraft, credibility is everything. Once intelligence is bent to serve narrative, credibility collapses internally long before it collapses externally. Analysts stop trusting the process. Policymakers stop trusting warnings. The result is strategic paralysis masked as confidence. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that it unfolds in a multipolar world where adversaries are no longer dependent on Western approval or validation. Russia does not need to persuade Washington that its red lines matter. It only needs to enforce them. When that happens, Western leaders will speak of shock and escalation, even though the logic was laid out step by step. The lesson intelligence keeps relearning at enormous cost is that reality does not negotiate with narrative. It asserts itself. States that insist on managing perception instead of assessing risk eventually lose the ability to do either. The United States still has power, allies, and options. What it is losing is the habit of intellectual honesty that once made those assets effective. Without that, strategy collapses into theater, intelligence becomes performance, and war arrives not as a failure of warning, but as a failure to listen